Hi friends! Today, let's write a letter to Santa.
Yeah, no offense, but I'm a little old to be penning my list of demands to jolly old Saint Nick. I address my letters to Krampus. It's a tale as old as crime, boys and girls. As the months fly off the calendar, with the promise of each new year, I am far more invested in announcements of classic horror getting HD transfers and pressed to Blu-ray discs than I am to new fear films releasing in theaters. Admittedly, nearly all of my beloved icons have already made the leap to 1080p or even better 4K. However, I'm an HD snob, and since I've been a bad little incarnate all year long, I'll happily forego my well-earned coal in the stocking for Christmas 2021, even if it ruins my 10-year streak, and exchange it for a wish upon a scar. If you saw my first wish list, then you know it's an even split of films waiting to get their day in the sun, and those that have already gotten their shine, but that I still wish to discuss. So, while the only thanks that Santa gets for giving you your Fitbits and PS5s during COVID Christmas Part 2 is non-lactose milk and diabetes-inducing cookies to give Kringle the skids, I have hopes that somewhere out there, there's a Scream Factory that'll answer my prayers to spread tales of terror and fright during this holiday season. A girl can dream. But before we dive in, let's get a word from our sponsors. If you're a frequent customer of Samsung the way that I am, you purchase everything from your TV and 4K players, from tablets and cell phones from the trusted brand. If you're already using Jabra headsets as your preferred audio tech provider, like I plan to very soon, then you know they provide a whole host of listening electronics ranging from workout earbuds, Bluetooth music headsets, and office hearing devices. If you use the link in the description for either Samsung or Jabra purchases, it'll help the channel out tremendously. With the promotional considerations accounted for, it's on with the show. This little number, released as part of a Blu-ray collection 2 years ago this month, included all 5 Fly films, and I was happy that it was brought along for the ride. Historically, this sequel has caught a lot of flack for not being as good as its predecessor, and admittedly, it's not, but that doesn't make it deserving of undue scorn or signify that it is without its merits. Far from it. Picking up several months after the events of the original, the child of a scientist that went mad and his lady love is born. The fear in the 1986 remake of the child being brought to term, having inherited his father's more disquieting qualities, is indeed realized, but because they manifest in medically captivating ways, no one assumes the worst. After all, what could be more innocent than a child? Unfortunate that the delivery was not performed at a mere hospital, but by the company that funded Seth Brundle's experiments. Tragic that this corporation isn't keeping the child alive to simply monitor and potentially experiment on him. That would be bad enough. It seems they've reclaimed his birthright, his father's teleportation pods, and they're banking on the son, having inherited dear old dad's mind, to unlock the secrets of this science and take this technology over. Unlike his father, whose mutations came about by a freak accident, his son's metamorphosis is out of his control. He was sired with these genetic abnormalities, cursed from birth. What started out as a wonder of science begins to show its teeth as the transformation takes a turn for the worst. While forging a friendship, he also makes an enemy and is forced to flee, but can't outrun what's brewing under the skin because his monster's already in his blood. While not as intellectual as the Jeff Goldblum predecessor, it's also not trying to be. Despite not having as strong of a cast, you still are invested in the heroes, especially the doomed prodigal son paying for the sins of the father. This film is fun to watch and delivers on the body horror. This British-German film just so happens to have a 2-decade birthday coming next year. During World War I, a squadron of British battalion lost in the fog of war take refuge within an enemy trench, but soon find themselves at the mercy of phantoms so monstrous they've terrified their German hosts to the brink of sanity. Ever since I was a kid, I have always loved the idea of unseen horrors on the hunt while man wages war with their brethren. Think Predator, Dog Soldiers, or the backdrop of the first Gears of War game. The idea of the killing carried out by something not quite human and capitalizing on mankind's wars as a shroud to conceal its own identity is something unsettlingly insidious. If you think that this premise is promising, just wait until you see where the soldiers have taken shelter. The maze-like trench network is the perfect breeding ground for horror. This film goes borderline Silent Hill with its psychological thrills and emergences of its terrors. These ghoulish apparitions seemingly appear from anywhere and rack the men with fear when they're not racking up the body count. No peace on earth. Speaking of making the leap to Blu-ray, it was in this 80s classic that the TV star made the jump from small screen horror hostess to big screen scream queen. After having critiqued films for nearly a decade, it was at long last her turn to get her own full-length feature. While toiling away on the TV scene of her weekly show and dreaming of the big lights on the center stage, Elvira gets word of an inheritance from her great-aunt's passing and sets out to suburbia Massachusetts. I like the fish-out-of-water story where this bride of Frankenstein's carefree attitude, curve-hugging gown, and tits are too much for the stuffy villagers, yet their teenage kids can't get enough of her, especially the boys. Turns out that the townsfolk aren't the only ones she's rubbed the wrong way, as her Uncle Vinny gets shorted on his inheritance and is after a cookbook?
It's a cookbook! It's a cookbook!
While Elvira proves that looks can be revealing, the book shows that appearances can be deceiving, as this seeming culinary manual is enough to leave the town and Uncle Vinny's ambitions spellbound. Elvira was already a standout knockout within the fear sphere, but her film debut paved the way for her to join fellow 80s icons of horror such as Robert Englund, Kane Hodder, Bruce Campbell, Brad Dourif, Michael Keaton, and Doug Bradley. Considering the Queen of Halloween just celebrated her 40th anniversary, now might be a good time to unwrap this macabre present. Okay, technically this one's a cheat because it's not a movie, it's a documentary, but it's of a celebrity of horror history. It has obvious ties to scary movies, and it's also my list, so maybe shut up about it. I understand that the name William Castle would be unfamiliar to the uninitiated, the casual fan, or the modern movie thrill seeker. Thus, imagine the role of the ringleader of a circus, your master of ceremonies at a banquet. William Castle was the P.T. Barnum of horror theater. Having determined that a simple, scary movie simply wasn't enough, he himself was the ultimate blockbuster, tearing down the fourth wall through the use of in-theater parlor tricks. What kind of gimmicks did he have up his sleeve, you ask? How good of you to ask. Watching the original House on Haunted Hill when the ghost would appear in the film meant witnessing inflatable skeletons passing through the audience. Sitting in on the OG 13 Ghosts would require you to use the Ghost Viewer, special 3D glasses to see the wayward spirits caught on film. Buying your tickets to Macabre entailed taking out a $1,000 life insurance policy as part of the film's marketing because the movie was just that terrifying. This extra mile effort and creative publicity stunts are what made Castle a legend worth remembering and a celebrity worth celebrating. And this documentary chronicles the many ploys and pranks he brought to the cinema-going experience. In an age of special effects and social media, this brand of showmanship is something that is sorely lacking, and cinema is worse off for it. The Ray Harryhausen documentary already got a Blu-ray release, so here's hoping this legend gets his well-deserved recognition as well. With all the campy presentation, gimmicks, and critters he unleashed in his movies, the fans that remember him await his acknowledgement, and certainly his monsters lie in wait for their return. All the creatures are stirring. This film checks off 3 boxes for me: 90s nostalgia, kids horror, and dark fantasy. Between the grandmother's narration and her grandson actually having momentarily encountered a witch attempting to capture him, the build-up to the eventual reveal of the witches was well handled. And then comes that reveal that is so gruesome. You know the one I'm talking about. This scene is so haunting that looking back on it, I'm left staggered, wondering how they even allowed this makeup effect in a PG kids movie, let alone how my fragile childhood mind even survived that level of dread. If the 80s had plot twists like the occupation of Ghostbusters eliminating spirits to be as commonplace a trade as firemen or police, or a bioexorcist where it is the ghost that attempts to banish the living who are haunting a house, then this 90s flick proposes the premise of witches from all corners of the earth gathering at a symposium like it was a parent-teacher conference.
Quite a twist, huh? Bet you didn't see that one coming.
Normally, a congregation like that would be imagined to take place in some shadowy forest or sinister cave, but in this film, it takes place in the same hotel assembly hall you'd expect to see, I don't know, Chinese entrepreneurs discussing making Snapchat bitcoins. For this film's sake, child abductors meeting for a summit like businessmen convening for a seminar reaches Epstein levels of horror. For my money, this one is right up there with the likes of Addams Family, Hocus Pocus, and Nightmare Before Christmas as not only all-time great kids' horror fairy tales, but proof positive that the last decade before the millennium was not dead for horror as many a vacuous pundit has peddled. This one may seem like a curveball, and even one that film buffs forgot existed, but that's the point of this list, right? This is actually a sequel to the 1976 remake, a film that I grew up on that upon rewatching, yikes. I see why it wasn't and hasn't been well received. However, as cheesy as this sequel is at times, I am at least happy to say that my childhood didn't fail me this time around. Waking up from his hangover, Kong discovers that Jessica Lange ran off with Jeff Bridges. Geez, you take one drunken spill off a skyscraper, but because there happen to be cameramen around filming your blackout, you're all of a sudden some kind of threat to national security or something? So, despite his drunken stupor lasting a decade, only now does Kong require, of all things, a heart transplant. Oh yeah, that's the only impacted organ? but his brain matter is intact after falling off the Trade Center. Okay, movie. So not only does Kong need a new ticker, but there just so happens to be a Lady Kong out there in the wild. Good thing she has the same blood type, right? But that's not all she's got compatible with Kong, if you catch my drift. They escape together, rampaging ensues, raging military pursues. They get down to that monkey lovin', you know the type. The hero of the story sacrifices himself, vanquishing the villain, and we have ourselves a monster movie. I love this film, not just because of its nostalgia appeal, but its enjoyable plot and relatable characters that were missing in the remake is what makes this worth a watch. It even has a post-Terminator Linda Hamilton as the sexy scientist, so I'm in. With the 70s remake getting the Blu-ray treatment in May of 2021, the same year of this video's recording, here's hoping some buzz gets going over this cult classic. With the king having found his queen, this match made in horror is overdue for their anniversary celebration, and their royal subjects await. Acknowledge their majesty, all ye faithful. This to me is the definitive dark fantasy film. I mentioned this in my Coroner's Report preview of October 2020 as a new Blu-ray released in time for Halloween. Within a fairy tale land, the Lord of Darkness sends his goblin forces to snuff out the Guardian of Light to usher in his return. With a hero of humble beginnings, and a princess, and even an evil Dark Lord, this movie is like the live-action version of Disney's Dark Cauldron done right, which just so happened to have released in the same year. As a display of how dire the severing of the Guardian's essence is, this act kickstarts a dark winter the likes that only Skynet or the Biden administration could unleash that chokes out the forest. Tragically, the hero and the princess learn that their romance was exploited by the goblins in the attack on the Guardian, and thus set out to right their wrongs. Considering the protagonist's childlike dwarf and elf allies, not to mention a fairy on their side, the heroes make up something of a dark spin on Peter Pan. All this leads to the return of the Lord of Darkness, and what an entrance he makes. This fiend turns out to be every bit as infernal as one would expect. Personally, I don't understand how it is that films like The Neverending Story and Labyrinth get such recognition when this movie is so obviously superior. At the risk of sounding repetitive of the sentiments shared in my previously mentioned episode, you've got a Ridley Scott film with Tom Cruise as the lead and Tim Curry, yeah, that Tim Curry as the Lord of Darkness. Why isn't this film more well known? I think we can all agree on this one. While The Twilight Zone set the standard for the TV anthology format, it is Tales from the Crypt that is undeniably the most popular. While I was greatly appreciative when this complete box set came out, I couldn't be the only one that was bummed that it was released as a DVD collection. That news wouldn't have sat well with me in 2007, when the Blu-ray format was first gaining traction. It sure as hell grinded my gears when this compilation released in 2017. If I can gripe for a moment, the fact is that 4K TVs, especially the big screen variety, that transcend the standard 40-inch size, are not kind to 480p video, and stretch those poor little pixels beyond their intended limits. Understanding licenses and budget and time, I think a show of this quality and legacy is deserving of an upgrade, considering that the comics that the show is based on provided enough material to adapt nearly 100 episodes into 7 seasons worth of program. This is the closest that horror has ever come to Marvel levels of success since The Walking Dead show. Assuming the style of gruesome morality tales, with about as pitch-black comedy as gallows humor gets, I could dedicate a full video reminiscing on all the classic episodes of this show, and in fact I will. To close out this entry on the list, and considering the holiday season, I will bring to your attention the second ever episode of Tales from the Crypt, that just so happens to feature an escaped mental patient targeting a murderous wife who just so happens to be dressed as Santa. Truly the winter of her discontent.
Naughty or nice?
The last candidate on this catalog that has already landed on Blu-ray is arguably more star-studded than the previously mentioned fairy tale film, both in front of and behind the camera. Directed by Ron Howard, produced by George Lucas, and starring the Leprechaun and Doc Holliday, Willow starts off with a Moses-like setup where the evil sorceress Nancy Pelosi imprisons all the kingdom's pregnant women for fear of the prophecy that a child will bring about her demise. Spirited away in a basket down by the river, the baby is found by the dwarf family of an aspiring wizard. After some hellhounds attack the village, Mini Gandalf assembles the Fellowship of the Crib to return the baby to its people and start the adventure, led by the Leprechaun. They soon encounter Doc Holliday hungover, but in a different manner than usual.
Nonsense. I've not yet begun to defile myself.
He isn't the only unintended ally the Leprechaun picks up along the way, as friends come from the most unlikely of sources. An enchantress, brownies, even an enemy turned accomplice. All this leads to the final confrontation at Castle Pelosi against the Witch Queen herself. I see so many Lord of the Rings tropes that were frankly done better here. I'm happy that the cult following that this film garnered gave it the justice it deserved, no doubt convincing the powers that be to release it on HD home video. This rounds out an underrated 80s trinity of dark fantasy films that include the aforementioned Legend as well as Return to Oz. And actually, Willow was the most financially successful of all its brethren, banking $137 million worldwide on a $35 million budget. Give it a watch and enjoy the adventure. With the remake having gotten the Blu-ray treatment in 2018, I thought it would have been only a matter of time before the original William Castle film would have followed suit. The wait lingers on, though. For the uninitiated, the OG House on Haunted Hill spins the story of eccentric millionaire, played by the incomparable Vincent Price, hosting a haunted house party promising $10,000 to each of his 5 guests if they stay the night. As if this premise isn't intriguing enough, Price and wife are unhappily married to the point that Price is convinced his blushing bride has previously attempted to poison him. The guests are from all walks of life, gathered in this house of death. The distribution of guns for their protection will do little to guard the guests against the restless spirits that haunt the halls. Whether it's films like Clue or Would You Rather, I love films like this where the mystery abounds under one roof and strangers must survive the night. This one just so happens to have ghosts in it. This was a William Castle film as previously mentioned, so gimmicks were naturally employed. Props from carnival haunted houses were used, which is about as fitting for the man's career as one could expect. If the William Castle documentary ever gets a visual upgrade, let's hope it does the trick and gets this work of movie magic some time to shine. But till then, to all a good night. I hope that you've enjoyed this list and would be interested in hearing some of your horror classics you wish can come to Blu-ray or, even better, 4K. Visual quality is only going to improve, and with censorship and cancel culture working overtime to rewrite and undo film history, the hope is that our favorite classics don't get sanitized in that restrictive tidal wave, our beloved movies don't get left in the dust, and these timeless heirlooms get pressed to discs with enhanced visuals before the Grinch that stole fictions sterilizes movie history for good. I'm counting on you, Scream Factory. I'm Inkarnate, reminding you to always remember.
Always be cobbling, always be cobbling.
I ain't just a big deal, I'm the real deal.
Warn your friends. Warn everyone.